Nat asked me to present some of our projects that we've done in the last few years on adaptive reuse, Greyfield redevelopment. And I have more of a conversational style of presentation, so I'm going to skip over details, but don't be shy at the end of the presentation to ask some questions. And how do you skip this? Okay, I'm having, oh, there you go. So yeah, starting with Greyfield redevelopment projects. This is a very nice one we've done. It's actually an old KFC. Many of you guys probably know that KFCs in Montreal kind of went bankrupt, at least most of them. And I see lots of these in the West Island, these small buildings on large lots, and they're completely asphalted. And so the idea behind the project was to build 41 units for families. And focusing on what made this project a success is, first of all, redeveloping a site that's an eyesore for the community. That's a huge heat island that Nat, you were pointing out those heat islands. This one was a big one. It's kind of hard to oppose these projects. So I think that's a good strategy, is targeting these properties that everybody just doesn't like to look at and everybody would love to see change. Also, one of the reasons behind the success of this project is that the project aimed families. I think it's important strategy to look at what the political will is in the area, in the borough, in the city, and whatnot. In this case, there was a strong support for family housing, and the political support for this project, well, they got it because that's what they want to do. At the same time, that doesn't mean if you're doing, for example, housing for homeless people, and that's not the political will, that does not mean that we should not do this type of housing. Just means that maybe we need to do extra efforts to put that in the political realm and make it an issue. Another project is the one that Nat was referring to. This one is a cooperative. It's called COOPERATIVE MONTAGNE VERTE. It's going to be the tallest cooperative in Quebec, one of the tallest in Canada. It's currently being built, as you can see on the images on the right. It's kind of very close to the Bell Center. For those who pass in the area, and it's right beside the Ville-Marie tunnel. And this is one of the exits. And so this little piece of land, how many times do I see this in the West Island? These extra little pieces of land around roads, around parks that are not parks, they're green, but they could easily be redeveloped. And the success behind this project, it's clear, it was municipal land. The city decided in Montreal proper, not agglomeration, very like city of Montreal, there's a big tradition. Public land is only sold for social housing, affordable housing. It's never sold for for private developers, because it's seen as if public land, well, it should serve the public, and social housing, affordable housing being an extension of that. And so at the same time, this is an interesting example because it's not that attractive. It's kind of beside a highway, although cubic condos had no problems selling their properties, which is quite remarkable. It says a lot about our market these days, but it's not that attractive. It's very small. In this case, there was a lot of easements, meaning that we couldn't build on some parts of the land, so we had to adjust the architecture. And all of these challenges make it that it's very difficult for the private sector to really look at these types of properties, want to develop. There are a lot of trouble. And so that's something that's positive, because when it's trouble for the private sectors, who can always beat us in terms of buying land, affordable land, they have so much more money and means than us. Well, we look at properties that sometimes have little problems and we look to fix them. Here's another example that's, I think, is very, very interesting for the West Island. This is a 53 unit project. It's a cooperative, but also a non-for-profit housing. And this is, as you can see on the image, the church complex includes a presbytery and a parking lot. And the new building, the cooperatives building, was built on top of the parking lot that was no longer in use, no longer served the community. As we know, churches around Canada are heavily struggling. Most of them are losing at least $300,000 a year, the parishes. So they need to do something with their land. And obviously there's a public use associated to churches. Parishers have been donating their money to fund the church, the land, the acquisitions throughout the 100, 200 years of existence. So there's this feeling that it should be for the community. So in this case, it was just a perfect fit. And again, it was not really looked at by the private sector because it's a very busy road. Not everyone wants to live beside a church. Not everyone wants to live beside, not in this case, but for example, a cemetery, a highway. Again, looking at things that maybe are negatives for the private sector, but that can be adjusted. And this is a very beautiful project architecturally. And churches, they're very complicated. They're not that easy. They're very slow to make decisions, but they have this awareness of like helping the community. And this is another project right beside the highway. Maybe that's the one that Matt was referring to, but this one is right beside the Highway 40 where it's elevated near Hunsick, near past Rockland. And this was a 60 unit project. It was all adapted housings for people that are deaf or that are blind. And this project, the main reason of its success is that it's an agglomeration of organizations. So different organizations got together, and you can imagine that it created more momentum, more noise in the political spectrum. And they came together to build on the first floor. It's all offices for these different organizations that serve this community. And above, it's housing for people that are deaf or blind. And this is a good example as well. When I was saying, okay, let's target lands that maybe are not that attractive for the private sector. At the same time, I think it's not great that we have affordable housing where, you know, it's not that nice. But at the same time, this project is a perfect example of, well, you know, we can mitigate the sound from the highway by curving the building, having different vegetation. For example, you see the building is curved here. Well, there's a reason behind that. It's not only aesthetic, is that we're reducing the noise hitting the building. And so what I'm trying to say is that there's different ways of looking at a piece of land and seeing the negatives and adapting it in something that in the end doesn't really matter. And again, you can imagine that this was not very attractive for the private sector, although these days we never know, anything sells. On to the reuse projects. I'm a big fan of this project called JOIE de Rosemont. It's a cooperative. Again, it's for family housing. And how many times again have I seen these properties laying around? This was an old medical center. It looks so bad from the outside. It looks very outdated, but this is just a render at the bottom because it's being built. As you can see on the right, we're about to finish the building. But don't be deceived by the looks when you look at these buildings. Really, we can do something interesting with buildings. And this one was heavily contaminated. One of the reasons why the private sector did not want to redevelop this property. And I think Nat pointed out some of the funding that's available. We got funding from the city that helped us decontaminate the building. And one of the things I want to stress is it's important to look who are the owners of this building. You know, there's like two types of owners. One owner, we call them the capitalists, the pure capitalists. They don't care about affordable housing. They don't care about the missions of our organizations. And them, they're very tough to deal with. But in certain instances, and I would say it's more prevalent than we think, we have what we call benevolent owners, meaning that they're very sensible to our cause and to the organizations that we represent. And they want to help their community. They have money, but they want to give back. And this is a good case of an owner being very patient with us, waiting a lot of months for our financing to come in and rejecting other offers because he wanted to have a cooperative for families in his neighborhood on his property. So that was very interesting. Another project that's being completed, as you can see on the right, is another church. And I think this project is a good example of saying be careful with churches because they're very hard to reuse. They have tall roofs. they have weird structures often that are not good for to transform into housing. So in this case, what we did is to preserve the heritage. We sliced the back of the building, demolished it, and kept the front to keep the heritage. And this was a big plus for the church that was selling to us, because they wanted to preserve the heritage. And at the same time, what we did is we demolished the presbytery and the 2 wings. And here it's a co-op and a non-for-profit. And this is a big project, 76 units. And also, heritage buildings are very hard. They're very complex to redevelop because of the laws, because of the costs. And a lot of times the private sector does not look at them, or when they do, they quickly move on because it's too complicated. But sometimes social housing, we're more patient. We have access to different funding. We can make it happen. This is the last one. It's a school in the West Island, in the suburbs in general. We have massive, what I would almost call campuses for certain schools. I think of Lindsay Place in Pointe Claire, just giant land that's very often underused. And this specific case was a school that was no longer used. And as you can see, it was done in 2 phases. The first phase being the kind of like the existing structure, and in the back in the schoolyard, we put another row of housing. So in the end, it was 2 phases, but in total 77 units. And the fact that it was 2 phases was very important for the financing. And often, sometimes we need to tone down our ambitions, look at a piece of land, looking at the financing and say, okay, maybe we can do 2 or 3 phases to make this project happen. And again, schools have public use associated with them. At the same time, our schools are very struggling in terms of their financing. So we can also help the public system by buying not the whole schools, but sometimes a piece of land that they might not want. And those are complicated endeavors, but they're possible. And also to note that zoning is very important when you do your analysis. It's often dictates your timeline. How long does it take to have your zoning change? And that is very linked with what you're going to do with your offer, how realistic your offer is, what can you offer in terms of, money and whatnot. So quick tips for new sites, kind of like a resume. The first thing is research the owners. It always helps when someone's benevolent, if it's a public institution of some sorts. And how to do that, go on Évaluation Foncière, which is a website. You type the address, you can see who the owner is, you can see often the address, you can research from there, find out where they live, their contact number. And there's also the Registre d'Entreprises du Québec, the REC. When it's a company number, you can go look that up and see who owns it and contact them. The second one is research your zoning. It's not for everyone. It takes a certain amount of knowledge, but you can use the city website. Every municipality has a planning help desk. Go to them, ask questions. Sometimes they won't respond to you, but hey, you can try. And the third one is really, obviously it's fun to target properties, but the financing is key. It's everything in this situation. Although sites are getting harder to find, but the financing is everything. And again, like I mentioned, take a look at the political will. Talk to your elected officials. What do they want? In the West Island, it's clear political will is for senior housing. So clearly senior housing projects will have an advantage. And if not, we'll talk to your political electives and try to push your ideas forward and make it happen in the political spectrum for your project to come to life.